right, looks like we are live now. So there we go. I think we're all four on my screen, so that'll be good. So we are here talking about Romeo and Juliet, our very last Shakespeare on stage discussion. So I have Kathleen Ryman and Samantha Fitch and Suki Waldenberger all here today. So we're going to talk about Romeo and Juliet. So I don't know about you guys, but I mean, I know Kathleen, you teach at the high school, so you probably have taught Romeo and Juliet recently.
I have not.
You haven't?
I have not. I have avoided it. I have hated it since I was a freshman. And so I teach Hamlet, I teach Henry V, I teach Much Ado About Nothing, but I have not. But I'm so glad you invited me to do this because watching that production was fabulous. Nothing like what I remember. Nothing.
Yeah, I probably haven't read this play since I was a freshman in high school. So it's been a long time and it was not what I remembered. So it was really cool to see. How about you, Samantha? What's your experience with this one?
So I actually agree with Kathleen, and I've, taken a couple of courses in grad school, so I've read it not that recently, but more recently than maybe when I was in high school. But I always felt like Romeo and Juliet was like the summer blockbuster of movies, where it really appeals to a wide audience and it has a lot of popularity, but it's really not the best thing. So that's always been my opinion. And even watching this production, I don't know, I still feel like he has so many other brilliant plays. And this is just not my favorite, but it's the production I thought was interesting. There's a lot to say about it for sure.
Yeah. Suki, I think you're the most Shakespearean of all of us.
Okay.
Last time you saw this one.
I first read this play in high school, and I remember that we watched the 68 Zeffirelli version. We watched the movie, and it was actually Hamlet that really turned me on to Shakespeare when I was in high school. But I remembered this play fondly, and I've seen it, I don't know, 4, 5, 6 different versions at least, between media versions and live performances. And I really like it, but you have to, I think, divorce the stereotype from the actual play, because everybody knows the stereotype, and everybody, that Romeo and Juliet is just a metaphor for tragic love and, parted lovers and that sort of thing. But it doesn't begin to capture the complexity and humor and sort of depth, I think, of the play itself. There's so much going on. There's so many interesting characters and situations and just concepts that are all blended together that that really get overshadowed because everyone just thinks it's about, two love-struck teenagers who end up killing themselves.
Yeah. Well, I think so. This is like some of the other tragedies that I've mentioned this in Hamlet. There's these hilarious moments in the middle of it,
Mm-hmm.
and that was the same here. The nurse was ridiculous. I had so much fun watching her just be absurd. It was awesome, really.
It's one of the best female roles in Shakespeare, I think, is the nurse. She's just hilarious.
Yeah. And I love the scene where she's like, oh, my back. No, the other side. And I mean, just all of these things. It's just like, she's just so funny and brings so much humanity to the scene. I think it's like real. You can see this really happening.
That's exactly it, is that she's teasing Juliet because she's known her since she was a baby. And so she can get away with it. And what I really love about it, it's just like what people do today. I mean, the scene early on where she's like, oh, you bumped your head and my husband picked you up. And she just goes over it again and again and again because, that's what people do when they're sort of reminiscing about the cuteness of their kids.
Well, I think it's interesting because I think Shakespeare does that a lot in all of his plays that I can remember. Is he always has the quotidian in there, so it's not like he sticks to these like high flying ideals or only like the deep things that you need to ruminate on. He always has the commonplace in there, and maybe that's part of that is to appeal to some of the audience that would have been there.
Yeah, that's true. But I think in this play, even more so, I mean, they interact, the sort of higher, the nobility and the clowns or the common people interact back and forth much more instead of just having sort of like these parallel stories going on. And I mean, and this is a fairly early play, so it's really extraordinary, I think, to see that real humanity just sort of interwoven into this really I mean, I think even at the time it was kind of a formulaic story of the lovers who end up being separated, and there's not a lot really. I mean, that goes back to antiquity.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because what I was reading about this play is that it was Shakespeare's first romantic tragedy, and it's embedded in a whole bunch of the romantic comedies from his early career. So there are a lot of similarities. If you just had Suki, you've got people running behind you.
I know, my husband's going back and forth.
Yeah.
No, is that Hannah? Eric was. As I think I've mentioned before, the laundry is right over there.
That's awesome. I told my family, you have to be quiet for an hour. Just be quiet. I don't know if it's gonna last, but we'll see. Anyway, I think it's funny because if you, with just a few minutes earlier in the ending, it would be more like a comedy, right? You'd have the happily ever after, you'd have the, if just a few things had aligned differently. And I think that's really interesting because it really does, it's kind of that balance of, okay, what's up to us and what's not up to us. Which is really interesting, kind of something that Shakespeare plays with a lot, right? Like fate versus free will. And
is it all's well that ends well? I'm trying to think. As I think I've mentioned before, I can never tell the comedies part because their titles are not don't make any sense. But he plays with the idea of faking death in Much Ado About Nothing. That's what it is. And that is a comedy because, they don't like cross signals. Well, there's only one hero fakes her death in order to prove her virtue, I guess. But yeah, so he's used that strategy or that plot point in a comedy as well. So you're right, it could absolutely have been, if they had just been a little smarter.
right.
Yeah, I know.
Go ahead, Samantha.
Well, I think he was working on, I forget which one it was, but he was working on a comedy or two while he was writing this as well. So,
I have a timeline up right now, and it says that the same time of Romeo and Juliet, it was Love, Labor's Lost, and Two Gentlemen of Verona.
Okay.
Those are two that both came out in 1594-95.
Yeah.
And then Richard II was right after.
Yeah. So it's interesting because this was relatively early on for him. So I don't know. I just enjoyed it. I think because I don't think we ever watched it in my small town. I don't know that we had the technology or whatever. I never saw it except for in modern, popular films that weren't really Romeo and Juliet. They were just like the popular version. So I knew the story, but I didn't catch all of the nuance that was in there. And even as I was watching the play, I was thinking, if I had read that, I would not have seen this in my head. And I think we've talked about that before, how it's really meant to be seen, not just read. It's hard to catch all of the things if you're not watching it on the stage. A lot of the interactions between the characters and things like that just kind of, you don't really understand what's going on, I think, without seeing it. Just adds so much to it.
In particular for me was how Juliet was portrayed, going back and forth between spoiled brat and a strong personality and knowing what she wants, and the fact that she was really mirroring the behaviors of the nurse versus her mother, because the nurse basically raised her. So she, with this production, it didn't surprise me that they went off and got married and went to bed, because the nurse was obviously promiscuous and that's who raised her. So no big deal, right?
It is kind of extraordinary how everybody goes, oh, okay, so you want to marry the, child of your mortal enemy? Sure, I'll help.
Mhm.
Right.
Because the friar does, right? Oh, sure, okay, come on, I'll marry you. And I mean, he says, I hope this will bring your families together. And once again, if this was a comedy, that's exactly what would have happened, is the two of them would have been married and the two families would have been reconciled because they're now part of the same family. But it is very just sort of, sure, you met him today, you met him yesterday and you're determined to marry him today. Okay.
Yeah, and I wonder how much that parallels Shakespeare's own experience in his own mind of his marriage, because of course it was very hasty and for a reason.
Yeah.
I think Kathleen's comment about Juliet was interesting because the whole spoiled brat thing and then knowing what she wants, because I'm wondering, and I don't know if there's any historical evidence, if his wife was maybe the one, because she was the one in this predicament, that was kind of knowing what she wanted and trying to speed things along and be hasty about the whole thing. I don't know. I haven't read anything about it, but I was just wondering.
That's interesting. That's an interesting thought, how much it mirrored.
Well, I did like in this production, and I saw a production at Ashland a long time ago now, maybe 10 years or so, where Juliet is a really vivacious young teenager. And once again, I think this is the difference between the actual play and the sort of popular vision or tradition of Romeo and Juliet, because I think a lot of people think of Juliet as this sort of languishing, drooping, trailing around in long skirts and sad and weepy. And she's not. She's her father's only daughter, or only surviving daughter, right? Obviously the pet of the family, and just a bright and I don't know, just pert. She's just very sure of herself, and it makes the tragedy all the more tragic, I think, because she's not yet 14 and is just, I think she's adorable, just bouncing around and obviously everybody's favorite, and then just crushed by this sudden love.
Yeah. Well, and that struck me. I mean, maybe my daughter just turned 18, so it's been a couple years since she was that age, but that's what I remember from that age. Girls that age are just happy one minute and devastated the next minute, and they're all over the place and excited. And the way she just kind of was like, screaming all the time and tell me now, it just was like, yep, she nailed 13 on to 14. She nailed that age for sure.
My 17-year-old is in the background. True. Yeah.
Yeah.
And, it's just so this day is never going to end.
Yes. Yes. That was, and I think that's part of what made this so much fun for me to watch, because it was so realistic. Like, oh my gosh, she just totally played that almost 14-year-old girl to a T. And obviously I think had fun doing it. It was really fun to watch that. But at the same time, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, how can this girl be getting married? I mean,
yeah, it's a little young. And I think even for Elizabethan times, I mean, marriage was not that early.
Right.
I mean, of course, if you're the princess of a country, you might get married off at 7. But in general, that was, I don't know if that came from an earlier source that he used, or his imagination of what Italians were like, or
I believe that wasn't he only 18 or something when he had to have permission, like from his
but his wife was like 26.
Yeah, 20. Yeah, something.
So this was a story, it's a couple centuries older, or almost, than Shakespeare. So it's from the 1400s, I think, the earliest version. So it was a story, and it was an Italian story that Dante wrote about it. And from what I was reading, I was doing my research right before, but so it's interesting to see that. I have my, this one was actually in my Bevington book, so I pulled it out to see what he had to say. And yeah, he says, if I can find where he talked about it, 1476, it was in, he says it was in 5th century Greek romance of Ephesioca. And then in 1476, it came out again, and then Porto in 1530. So it was something that had been kind of rehashed, but Bevington says that Shakespeare probably only read a poem by Arthur Brooke, which was published in 1562, which was actually called The Tragical History of Romeus and Juliet. So I thought that was interesting. So he had this one story, but it was a story that kind of had history. And I guess there are some folks who think it actually happened at some point. So that's interesting.
Well, it's a common story theme of, star-crossed lovers, of course, comes from Shakespeare, but the idea of, you can go all the way back to, stories of like Psyche and Cupid, where they are allowed to meet at night in the dark, but had to be he had to leave before daylight, because if she saw him, terrible things would happen. And then, of course, terrible things happen. But yeah, I think just like romantic tragedy is I don't want to say popular, but a enduring story type.
Well, even like last time we were talking about Antony and Cleopatra, and there's certainly star-crossed lovers, and how their story was famous from their own days onward. So
yeah.
Well, and it's interesting. That was one of the things that I jotted down. It's interesting that we watched that play last week, which was about, but that was 1607. So maybe 10-ish years, a decade later, but they both also die in the end. And so what do you guys think? Do you see what's different in the two stories? Besides the obvious. I know that's a hard question, but it's one of the questions that they said to ask.
I don't know. I think Shakespeare by that time had experienced a lot more trauma and personal pain, and was wiser maybe about love and about everything, relationships, parent-child relationships. He had lost a lot, and he wasn't dealing so much with the even though it was tragic in Romeo and Juliet, but the joys of youthful love. I mean, these were Antony and Cleopatra were older, much older.
Yeah, and very innocent. I mean,
Right.
Romeo and Juliet are very innocent as opposed
Right.
to.
Right.
Yeah.
They're Antony and Cleopatra. I mean, in both stories, they're swept away by love, right? And don't care about anything else. Then nothing is more important than them being together, or them giving into their passions. But their situations are so different, right? Neither Romeo nor Juliet really have any power. They're enmeshed in their family feud. And even though they think, and like I said, the friar thinks that maybe this love, and I think the nurse thinks this too, that their love would heal that division. I mean, it doesn't. Well, it does. Their death does.
Right.
But both Antony and Cleopatra, like we talked about, are, powerful people who give into their passions, uncaring of what it's going to do to Egypt and to Rome and to other wives and husbands and children. So it's a lot less, I don't know, forgivable, maybe.
Yeah. And Romeo and Juliet are so confident in each other too. Whereas with Antony and Cleopatra, we saw Cleopatra doubted Antony, and there was a lot of that, which comes from experience. Like you said, Samantha, they don't know if they can trust each other. Whereas in Romeo and Juliet, that doesn't even really enter their minds.
Mm-hmm.
They're 100% sold and sure that their love is real. So that's interesting.
Something to think about when we think about the women as they're portrayed. Cleopatra as a ruler, she had a lot more agency, the ability to make choices. When I think historically about a girl of Juliet's age, she really didn't have any say in what was going to happen to her. And so her stepping out and doing those things, to me, seemed very powerful, because culturally there's that's going against everything that she would have been taught. So I think that showed a lot of strength towards the female, because it's still a tragedy, but she made those deliberate choices, and to me that's kind of surprising for the time period. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I think, because we see both sides in the play, we see that she's powerless to stop this marriage to Paris. I mean, she has no say whatsoever in what happens, and yet she has already secretly gotten married. And she orchestrates this whole fake death thing by going to the friar. So to me, I was watching the end thinking, if she was that, like, why didn't she just sneak out the window again?
I was thinking the same thing, that, you know, the friar's her confidant, her confessor, right? And married her. I mean, this is the old, well, why didn't Hamlet kill his uncle in the third act, right? If she'd done that, there wouldn't have been a good story.
Right.
But I mean, one, the idea of a woman like traveling to Mantua by herself. I mean, I was thinking this because the scene where she tries to refuse the marriage and her father becomes really violent.
Yeah.
And the actor who played Capulet in this production was, you know, played him as this really emotional man, right? He swings from woohoo, we're gonna have a party and everyone have fun, to rage, you know, and he really is abusive toward Juliet in this scene. And, you know, but he says, you know, I don't ever want to see you again, or, you know, you're no daughter of mine if you don't marry Paris. And that would have been the perfect time for her to go, you know what? He's not. I'm not anymore. And you add this to, I'm getting my Shakespeare's confused, because I'm also doing a reading. I'm in a reading group, so on Saturdays we just get on Zoom and read Shakespeare. But I think it was in King John, and Blanche says, you know, she's just been married to the king or to the prince of France, but she's the niece of the King of England, and they married. The marriage was supposed to bring the families together, and then 15 minutes later it blows up again. And she says, well, what am I supposed to do? Where do I go? Do I go with my husband, or do I go with my uncle and my, you know, the family I've grown up with and lived with all my life? But she chooses the right decision for an Elizabethan woman, which is her husband. Right. And Juliet goes through the exact same thing when she finds out that Romeo killed Tybalt. Wait a minute, this is my cousin. I'm supposed to hate the Montagues because we have this family feud going on, but he's my husband. And I thought the actress did a really good job of talking through this. But wait a minute, Tybalt would have killed Romeo. Romeo's my husband. So I have to hate that Tybalt was going to kill my husband. So I can't, you know, and she finally triangulates to get herself to a position where she can say, no, it's okay. It's okay, because Romeo's my husband, and my first loyalty is always to my husband. So why didn't she just sneak out the window, you know, the nurse, and she, you know, saying, you know, I have to go to my confessor because I had a fight with my father and I need to atone, and then scurry off to Mantua.
Yeah, well, there's a lot in this play of decision making where a poor decision causes the tragedy, right? So we have the Mercutio is being so, you know, dramatic. He's always ready for a fight, and because of that kind of causes Romeo to be banished in the end, and then Romeo kills Tybalt. If he hadn't done that, then he wouldn't have been banished, and then they could have figure things out. Like, it's just interesting how he's playing with that idea, back to that idea of fate versus free will. How much, you know, in the end, it's kind of like, well, the gods or whatever determine that this is what should happen. But a lot of it was people's decisions, making rash decisions or unwise decisions that caused a lot of the tragedy. So it's kind of interesting to see the balance between those two things.
Well, yeah, because Romeo's like trying to stop the fight between Tybalt and Mercutio. But when, he finds out that Mercutio is dead, suddenly he's just like, okay, I got to kill Tybalt, right? That's the only thing it's almost like he forgets Juliet, because then afterwards he's like, oh, Juliet. Oh, that's right. I'm married.
Together for, a couple days. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that was a bad decision. That was a very bad decision on Romeo's part.
Yeah.
But it's back to this theme of how can you resist strong emotion? It's going to force you to do its will, whether it's you fall in love, or you blindly hate.
Yeah. Well, and I think the ending is interesting because it kind of has a really clear moral of the story. Like it's your hate that caused you to lose the biggest joys. And they were joys, both of them. I mean, Romeo was kind of tragic in the beginning, but like they were both just these bright young people that were so exuberant, and they brought everyone around them happiness, and they're gone because of the hate of their family. So it was a really strong statement at the end. And I don't know that we normally get that kind of moral of the story in Shakespeare. I feel like it's
More complicated.
Most of the time. This one was pretty.
I think it's made clear in the play that they're both the only children of these families. I know that Juliet is, because her father says, like, all the earth has taken all my other children. So all of, they've all died. But yeah, so I mean, these families, there's no worse punishment than a family can have, like if you're concerned about lineage, and then just not to mention the individual emotional impact of parents outliving their children, right?
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting. Sorry, Samantha. You go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead, you.
I was just going to say it's interesting because in the one scene, the mother says that she was about Juliet's age when she got married, but she's portrayed as very elderly in the play. So it could be, if they lost all those children, that that was kind of my impression. She's like the surprise at the end of your life. And so even more cherished.
Right.
Than, if you just had one child and didn't have not that they wouldn't be as cherished, but that it's that, oh my gosh, here's this blessing at the end of my life that I didn't expect. And you cherish that even more so, maybe. And so that loss was even heavier on them.
Well, and I think that's part of the frustration of watching the play, is that obviously as the audience, you realize it. And there are all these mini dramas going on that reflect the bigger drama of this group mentality of, the two families that are at war against each other. And so even though it takes like Mercutio until being, stabbed to finally realize, I'm done with both of you, this isn't worth it. Right. But you're from this, and then it still goes on and continues on. And I don't know, I guess nothing new under the sun, right? Because it's a very familiar feeling that people have all of this hatred, but for what, and you pick a side and you're on a side, and it ends in tragedy. And
I think I mentioned at some point to someone, I can't remember now, when I saw the production in Ashland, the director had decided that he really wanted to emphasize the theme of how do you teach a younger generation to hate? How do you pass on sort of a familial or a country's or, a hatred to young people who haven't, whatever started this, we don't know. But it's not just the kids, but the servants, well, why I have to hate this person, and I'm going to take offense at anything because that's what I'm supposed to do. And so it was really interesting to just to sort of contemplate that, is how do you teach people to hate someone else because they're supposed to, not because they've actually had any kind of experience that would prompt that feeling.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, Suki, because there's that moment in the play where Juliet finds out who Romeo is and says something along those lines. If I would have known who you were, I would have never loved you. But now that I know who you are, I can't hate you.
Right.
And it's that, like that, it is exactly that learned. If she hadn't met him, she would have hated him. So it kind of opens that, like, well, you can't, how can you hate someone you don't know? And it's kind of under the radar in this one, but it's definitely there. That's really interesting.
I was just looking up, this is completely different topic, but you were saying that he was writing Richard the Second about the same time that he was writing this play. Because when I was listening to, no, thank you. When I was watching the play, and in that big scene with Juliet and her father, he says, "Thank me no thankings, nor proud me no prouds," right? Because she says, I'm not proud to marry, but I'm not proud to have this marriage arranged for me, but I thank you for it. And he says, "Thank me no thankings, nor proud me no prouds." Mm-hmm. And we just read Richard II last Saturday, in which Richard's uncle says, "Grace me no grace, nor uncle me no uncle. I am no traitor's uncle." And he's angry at Henry IV, who's coming to usurp the throne of Richard II. So that phrase was in his head when he was writing both of these, and it just because of the juxtaposition I just noticed that.
Yeah, that's interesting.
That is interesting. Well, you think of all the different stories that are going on in his head, and he's writing all these things at the same time. I don't know if any of you had a chance to watch there was an intro video that I found, a gal who teaches in England, and she was pretending that she was in Shakespeare's time going to the play and kind of talking about how at that time he was really young, he was kind of new on the scene, and these other people have written so much more than him, but I think we're really going to enjoy this one. It was really interesting to kind of get that perspective, because we kind of think, it's Shakespeare, but at that time, he hadn't really built that reputation quite yet, which is interesting to think about.
Yeah, the other thing I wanted to say, I was really struck by the word choices and the plays on words, but it almost seemed heavy-handed compared to some of his later works. And that lady bringing this up, would his audience at the time would have thought, okay, he's good, but he needs a little bit more work, kind of thing? Or
I don't know. It crossed my mind.
It seemed very heavy-handed compared to some of my favorites that come later, like Hamlet, where things are far more subtle. The same comedy is there, it's just not so much in your face.
No, I agree. That's why I thought it was kind of like the blockbuster, because I think the humor in it appeals a lot more to, well, it's a very basic humor sometimes, and it's not as subtle or skillfully woven in as some of his other plays.
Well, and if you look at like what sells now, the same kinds of things sold then, I noticed, right off the bat, you have this sword fight, right? So there's fighting and there's this crazy body humor, and it's very much, you can tell he's trying to appeal to the audience because he wants this play to show multiple times and be popular. So it's interesting to kind of think about it in a different way. Like, what was he thinking when he was writing this. And maybe as he matured, he was popular enough that he could use that skill that he had and not try so hard to get the, get the thumbs up from the audience, maybe. It's hard to think Shakespeare doing that.
Yeah, but it still reminds me more of like Restoration Theater Baud than the smooth presentation of jokes that is found in the later works. Is that what his audience wanted? Well, maybe it really was, because after everything shut down and it was brought back up in Restoration, that's almost all you saw. So maybe that is playing to the audience.
Well, and yeah, especially if, this is a fairly young playwright who doesn't have the patronage of the Queen yet, right?
Mhm.
So he's writing more for a general audience, even though, they continued obviously to play for a general audience. But he wouldn't have been arranging plays, in court. So that may have, I don't know, maybe that changed his style to some extent, because he had a more sophisticated audience to play to.
Yeah, because you do get the sense with the later ones, like you said, Kathleen, it's a little bit more subtle. And so everybody gets it on some level. You can be not offensive, because it's kind of under the radar, but people will still get it. So it's, I don't know. It's just really interesting to think about that, how he might have, whether it was just he became more skillful as a writer, or whether it was who he was writing for.
But this was one of his most popular plays, I think, even in his lifetime. And it's certainly one of the more popular plays since his lifetime. I mean, as we said, everybody knows at least, the bare bones of the plot. And not so much of, All's Well That Ends Well, or
right.
Pericles.
Yeah, definitely not Pericles. Oh, goodness. Well, what was funny, and just to tag on to that, Suki, is, Star Wars is even, there's a line in here where it says, "Go live and be prosperous." And I was like, what? There's live long and prosper. It came from Shakespeare. It's crazy. But, it kind of goes back to what we've talked about several times, that there's so much in our popular culture that comes from Shakespeare that if you don't understand it, you don't get a lot of the depth that's there. So it's really that I got a little giggle out of that this afternoon when I saw that. Okay, so I'm looking to see if we have any other really awesome questions to talk about. Okay, so this is an interesting one. If Romeo and Juliet hadn't died, if it had turned out more like a comedy, what would their lives have actually been like? You guys think they would have lived long and prospered, or do you think it would have been they were heading for disaster?
I think it depends on whether you believe in love at first sight. I mean, Romeo is shown to be just this, he wants to be in love, right? He starts, "Oh, Rosaline, and she won't pay any attention to me." And then, "Okay, come to this party and we'll try to take your mind off her and show you that there's other pretty girls in the world." And then boom, he's in love again.
Right.
And Juliet's no better. I mean, she's not, she seems to be this obedient daughter, right? "Okay, if you want me to marry Paris, I will look upon him. And if, that's what you want, we will try to do it." And then, she's willing to defy convention and her parents and everything else in order to marry. So if that's an indicator of a true and, abiding connection, yeah, they'll be fine. If it's not, well, they're married. There's no divorce.
Well, and maybe it's part of what we were talking about before too, about Shakespeare's evolution in his life, because it doesn't seem like he had a very happy marriage. And then when you get to the later plays, like with Antony and Cleopatra, you can see the couples are not just, it's not pure love, and their death doesn't solve anything. And so I don't know, maybe as Romeo and Juliet went on with life, it would kind of go downhill a little bit.
He was doing that the other day.
Kathleen, what do you think?
You know, just sitting here thinking horrible thoughts. Another couple it reminds me of is Lydia and Wickham in Pride and Prejudice.
Oh,
Impulsive. Yes, let's go elope. Let's go do this thing. And then you see them at the end of the novel miserable with each other. And I just think that it wasn't a healthy relationship. I hate to say that. I just don't see it being, you know, yeah, successful.
Yeah, well, I think just the warning sign for me is Romeo's wants to kill himself over Rosaline, and then like 5 minutes later, he's in love with Juliet. And what happens when he sees a pretty face the next day? I mean, I'm surprised he didn't find someone new when he was banished, you know?
Yeah.
So
it reminded me of The Graduate. And think about the end of The Graduate, where they've got it. They ran away from the marriage and they're sitting in the bus. And suddenly they're just like, hey, now what do we do? But you know, Shakespeare's comedies do allow for true love and love at first sight, right? That's the comedy, is that, you know, ends in a marriage happily ever after. You're not supposed to push it any further than that.
yeah, well, and the thing that I saw in the comedies a little bit too is that it's friendship is important and partnership is important. And I don't know how much Romeo and Juliet had that partnership basis that we see in some of the other ones. I mean, even what's the one I'm thinking of where they, I think Beatrice maybe and Benedict.
That's Much Ado About Nothing.
Yes, like because they fight in the beginning, but they've known each other forever, and their banter is really a form of friendship, right? And so when they get together in the end, we see, oh, they're going to be great partners for each other. They're perfect for each other because they can stand up to each other, their wits match, all of those things. And we don't see that. All we see that about Romeo and Juliet is they're both like wholehearted, 100% into whatever they do. But it's an interesting, I thought that was an interesting question. It reminded me when I was a freshman, we had to write an alternate ending to Fahrenheit 451. And it was kind of one of those things. Ever since then, you know, I rethink, well, what would have happened if, and you kind of think, well, what would go on in that case? So it would be interesting to see.
You mentioned the word friend, and so I've got the text up here, and Juliet calls Romeo her friend. Right? Art thou, this is when they've spent the night together and he has to leave. He's about to be banished. Art thou gone so, love, lord, I, husband, friend, right? And I do think that that's a very Elizabethan understanding of a good marriage, is that the husband and wife would be friends, would enjoy their company, enjoy each other's company, and like each other as well as love each other.
Yeah, even though that might not have been the reality, right? At that time, there was a lot of marriage for property and title and things like that. But to think that that was an ideal, or maybe could it have become an ideal because of the ideas in Shakespeare's plays, or does it predate that?
Well, I mean, Elizabethan culture didn't shy away from sex, right? It wasn't, we've been affected by the Victorian era, which came later and which really sort of made it taboo. But, Elizabeth, they laughed about, there's all those dirty puns and, it's in Shakespeare, and references to genitalia and pregnancy and things like that. And that's how Elizabethan culture kind of was. So a marriage was, I think at that time, you wanted to at least like your partner, right? I think it's early in the play when they're discussing the marriage of Juliet with Paris, and they say something like, well, what do you think? Do you think you could love him? Right? They're even giving her the opportunity to try. Right. I don't think she doesn't have the power to say no, but it's like, what do you think? Do you think you could?
They ask the question, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, and once again, it would depend on the more money or property you have, the more likely a woman would be a pawn to either political or financial mechanizations. But I don't know. I always tell my students, look, most parents want their kids to be happy, even if the culture has an arranged marriage tradition. They're doing it because arranged marriages are just as likely to be successful as love matches. Even if there isn't like great love at the beginning, if the romantic love's not there, a lot of arranged marriages, well, they do become friends because they've agreed that they're going to do this together. And then, so I don't think that I think it is kind of shocking, probably for the audience, that Juliet's father goes just off the rails. And, at least in this production, is yanking her around the stage and calling her names. And I mean, it's a violent scene.
Yeah, I mean, he tells her she can go be homeless.
Yeah.
And yeah, that way it was, because even up to that point, he was so jovial and we're going to have a party and this is going to be great. And then like, it's okay. Romeo's a great guy. It's okay that he's here at the party. I mean, we have all of this and then all of a sudden, like, crazy. It was.
Yeah, here it is. It's like Lady Capulet says, what say you? Can you love the gentleman? You'll see him tonight, and both she and the nurse like, and he's very handsome and he's very noble, and speak briefly. Can you like of Paris's love? And Juliet's response is, I'll look to like if looking liking move. But no more deep will I endart mine eye than your consent gives strength to make it fly. So yeah, I'll give it a shot. I'll see, but I'm not gonna, but I'll be guided by what you say. Right? And yet later it's like, marry him, or, I mean, her father says, I'll just give you away. I'll just give you to some random guy if you don't marry. Though I guess he's angry because he thought that this was a done deal and he's given his word.
Right. Well, and isn't he, Paris, isn't he kind of a nobility member? That because the Capulets and the Montagues are merchants, right? They're not nobility. And so if Paris is nobility, then it could be marrying into a title. It could be like that, his reputation for his business. It could have a lot of deeper implications. So maybe that would have made sense to people in that audience. But it certainly, it did not make sense to me. It's like, how did this guy go from being this great, kind, loving dad to you can just live on the streets? I don't want to see you ever again. Like, it was, And the mom and the nurse just kind of like, okay. I mean, the nurse doesn't even come up with any ideas for how to get her out of this. Just, it's okay, just marry him.
Yeah.
Figure it out later. Like, what? So
Well,
that
once
was
again, if there was a way out, we wouldn't have had a tragedy.
true. Yeah. Yeah. Well, do you guys have any last thoughts? It's 7:28, so we have 2 minutes left.
I just had a question for those of you who have seen more productions, because I've only seen one in high school, and then the ones like you were talking about, Karen, that are more, pop, like Leonardo DiCaprio, stuff like that. But I thought this one was incredibly dark. I mean, like there were no lights literally almost on stage. And of course, I don't think that the play would have been performed in the evening. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think usually they're, brighter. And so I was just wondering what you thought about that. And I was trying to decide whether it highlighted the humor or whether it detracted from it. And I can't. So I don't know, for those of you who've seen more productions, what you thought.
Well, it certainly struck me. Almost everyone's wearing black. Black or red. And Juliet is, well, except for at the party, some of the ladies are wearing different colors, but Juliet's the only one that sort of stands out in pale colors. And I don't know what to think about that staging either. I don't know what they were going for. I mean, if you're talking about historically, the plays would have been, if they were in like the theater, the actual theater, it would have been during the day with the open roof to light. They would have been performed in courts by candlelight, indoors for a much, much smaller audience. But yeah, it was almost Puritan in its attire.
Yeah.
And those girls that came out with the round, candle globe things with the white caps and the very severe black dresses. I'm not really sure what that was, what that choice was about.
That would be interesting to maybe see if the pre-show or something, which I didn't watch this time, maybe talked about that, because I mean, my youngest is 4, so he would not understand Shakespeare at all, but he just popped onto my lap for a minute when they were coming in. He's like, "Are those the angels?" Like, he's like, it just seemed to him like everyone was dead, and that was,
Well,
like,
I don't know. Maybe that
death?
is, the theme that they were trying to emphasize is death. And certainly Romeo and his boys were wearing sort of like almost skull masks at the party.
Right. Yeah, and then the guy had the hook, the apothecary had the scary scream mask thing on, right? Which I know was tied to something else. I've seen that somewhere else. I don't remember where. Do any of you guys know what that? I feel like it came from something, but I don't remember what. The weird nose mask thing.
Yeah, there's some sort of symbolism with the mask, like in Carnival, right? Like in Venice. Like I don't know. We were looking at masks actually when we were in Italy and reading about them, but I can't remember the symbolism of that one.
Yeah, so it was a lot of dark, like it was emphasizing the tragedy part, the tragic part, and kind of keeping the mood so somber, even though there was a lot of lightness in it. And I don't know, Juliet was always wearing a lighter color, so maybe they were trying to make her more bright. It is interesting. That was a really good observation, Samantha. I'm glad you brought that up here at the end. Anything else? Kathleen, did you have anything else?
The only thing I'm going to say is, for someone who had literally only read the play a long time ago and then watched it, I love the minimalist approach to the set. I didn't want the set to take away from the words, but that's because I've taken 4 Shakespeare classes, so I wanted to get drawn into the words and then let the actors complete the meaning. And for me, the minimalist set didn't bother me at all. The light and the dark was very obvious. I love the circular, you can't see anything with my background. I love the circular globes, almost as if they were portraying some sort of a time or a barrier between the life and the death. I would love to rewatch it, and I probably will, to kind of pay more attention to what those may have symbolized.
Well, you know, there's a lot of sun and moon in the play.
Mhm.
And there is a lot of light and dark imagery, you know, words that relate to daytime and nighttime and light and dark. So yeah, they may have been playing that up.
Yeah. All right, ladies. Well, it's 7:34. So this was,
Thank you for having us.
it was really fun. Thank you guys for joining me. Suki, you've been here like almost every time this summer. Samantha, you were here a couple times. Kathleen, you stepped in at the last minute once. You saved me one time. That was awesome. So I just really appreciate you guys coming to this last one and being a part of Shakespeare on Stage. I think it was a really fun thing to do this summer.
Yeah, it was great.
It was fun. Thank you so much.
All right, guys. Well, have a good rest of your week, and
Yep.
we'll see you when school starts in a couple weeks. Well,
bet.
see you online. All right. Have a good week.
Good
Bye-bye.
night.
Bye-bye.